Cool. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining me this evening. So this session, we're going to talk about budgeting. So I'm going to go through some general overall budget things, incomes, expenditure, and some general kind of bits of advice. And then I'll talk about some more Vault Festival specific things to think about while you're creating your budget. And then I'm gonna try and rattle through that, and then we can just maybe do it more of a conversation. If you guys have any questions or anything specific that you wanted to talk about, I may or may not have the answer. If I don't have the answer, I'll try and work it out with you, or I will go off and find the answer. So but yeah, so let's share my little guy, done little slides. Fab. So I'm being a bit slow. There we go. So yeah, so today we're going to be talking about budgeting for a show at Vault Festival. A little caveat is that most of my experience sits within theatre and a little bit of dance. And so if you're coming from the late nights program or the comedy program, my references might not be like completely relevant, but hopefully this session is sort of broad enough that it will be helpful to anyone. But if for whatever reason I don't answer any of your questions or deal with the specific thing that you're worried about, just let me know, and then we can work it out together, or you can speak to either the comedy or lates programmers. So a tiny little bit about me. My name is Johanna Taylor. I'm the senior producer at Vault Creative Arts, who are the organisation that produce Vault Festival. My background, like I said, is mostly in theatre. I've worked at places like Dance 4 in Nottingham, Birmingham Rep Theatre a long while ago, Arts Council. I was most recently Improbables. You got a question? No, I'm going to put you on. Try and put you on mute. Hello, whoever's taken themselves off mute, could you go on mute, please? There we go, I found them. And so yeah, so I have a bit of a mix of experience in independent and organizational, mostly within producing, but a bit of sort of project management. And so today we're going to talk a little bit about generally what a budget is. That's going to be very swift. We'll go over some stuff about income, briefly some stuff around fundraising, which we can have a bit more of a conversation about, some stuff around expenditure. I thought it'd be helpful to just throw in a bit of a further explanation of what the venue cost guarantee is, just to make sure that you guys are including it while you're budgeting. There are a few really helpful bits that you can include in funding applications as in-kind support from Vault Festival. So I've kind of put some examples of what that could be, depending on the length of your run and things like that. And then just another little reminder of upcoming workshops, and then a space for questions. I've said that at the end, but if you have questions sort of throughout the workshop, please feel free to ask. You can use the chat, or you can just take yourself off mute and just ask the question. I don't mind being interrupted. So what is a budget? So Within this context, I'd say that it's an estimated calculation plan of income and expenditure over a defined period of time or project, or for a project. And so that I would say that it's not something that is absolutely set in stone, and to think about it as something that is just helping you plan. It can be a really, really helpful tool to help you figure out exactly what resources you need, and is sort of a key part of like your strategy and planning process. I think it's also really great to use your budget alongside a cash flow, but sometimes that feels slightly like overkill if you're if it's a small project and it's just going over like a couple of weeks. But I think just in terms of that, making sure that you're using, while you're budgeting, thinking about when that money is going to come in and when it needs to go out. I think it can be really easy to think about it all as something quite static, and then before you know it, you've kind of overcommitted to fees, or you've committed to fees to be paid before you've received your settlement, or before you've received your final chunk of money from the Arts Council, and then you're in a bit of a predicament. So just thinking about keeping in mind when that money is coming in and when it needs to go out, and just making sure that you actually have the money in the bank when needed. But I think that for a simple project, that is just something that can kind of be tied in with the budget. And so what have I got here? So I've done a really, really sort of simple income. So normally when you do your budget, you have your income and you have your outgoing. For a not-for-profit, non-commercial show, you want your budget to balance. So you want the cash income to be the exact same as your outgoings, especially if you're going to be applying for Arts Council funding. They won't you won't get very far if your budget doesn't balance, but that's mostly just because they don't support projects that are for profit, basically. So they just so you need to make sure that you're taking all of your fees into consideration within that. So you're not just thinking, I'll just take what's left at the top. Consider it all within there. So this is my example of an income section of a budget. Again, these numbers are completely made up, so don't look too carefully at them. But you'll notice that, shall we start at the top? So at the top, we've got description, which is just the description. What is it? What is the thing that's coming in and out? And then I think it can be really helpful to put a unit cost and then your multiple, which is what I call it, but they sometimes have different names. And you basically times the unit cost by the multiple, gives you the total. So that is really helpful if you're going to be if your budget is going to be changing, if your plans are changing. So for instance, you might have donations is a good example. So if we're planning to have 10 separate people donate £50, and then for whatever reason your plans change and actually you need a bit more, so you can just change the multiple and be like, okay, well now we're aiming for 15 people to give however much that would be. And so that can be really helpful to make your budget a bit more flexible, and so you can edit it more easily if you're doing that. And also just for clarity as well, I think. And then another really helpful thing I think to have in your budget is an actuals column. And so basically your actuals are the actual money that came into your bank account. You might have a notes bit where you write a little that has the sort of dates of when money came in or came out. But I think it can be really, really helpful to, next to each other, be able to see this is what I was expecting to come in, this is what has actually come in. And then you might also want a column that is sometimes called a variance, which is basically what you're expecting, take away what you actually got, so that then you can see really clearly what is still left and what you're expecting. And so I think it could be really, really helpful, just so you can like glance, you try and make your budget make sense to you personally. So there are some basic bits that kind of need to be in there, which is your income and your expenditure, and exactly how much it is and a description of what that is. But the amount of detail that you put in there, I think, is kind of whatever is helpful for you, but making sure that you can glance at it and have a really good idea of what status the finances of your project are currently in. In this, I've split the cash and the in-kind in separately. The main reason for that is because you want to make sure that your income and your expenditure cash is balancing. So if you take into consideration your in-kind when you're trying to make your budget balance, you're kind of taking into consideration money that isn't real money, so you can't spend the in-kind, so then it kind of throws you out, and then it makes you look like you've got more money than you actually do, and at the end you'll be like, oh god, where's that additional 2 grand gone? And it's because it never actually existed, because it was in kind. So definitely make sure that you're splitting those out. If you're applying for Arts Council funding, that will sort of split out automatically anyway. But when you're preparing your Arts Council application, you'll need to prep your budget on like an Excel spreadsheet or Google Sheets or something. Anyway, so I'd try and kind of separate them out, because it will make it much easier when you're moving everything in.
Hi, sorry, I have a question.
Go for it.
Can you please explain the difference between cash and in-kind again? Sorry, it kind of passed me.
Oh no, you're all good. So cash is cash, so it's like actual money that you're going to get in. So it might be a grant, it might be money from your ticket sales, it might be money from donations, but it's actual money that's going to go into your bank account. Whereas in-kind support is, I don't really know why it's called in-kind support, but in-kind is when you receive something from someone who's supporting you that has a monetary value, but you're not receiving the money. So for instance, you might receive some mentorship, and the mentor would normally charge £200 a day for their time, but you're receiving that time for free. So it's kind of like a little cyclical thing, like the money comes in and then it goes back out and you never really see it. So it's like you've paid them, or they've paid you £200 to then pay them back that £200, if that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you. That does make sense. I'm just looking here. So where it says, okay, no, I got it. Thank you.
Are you sure? I'm happy to explain again.
No, that makes sense. Yeah, that's fine. Thank you.
Okay. But yeah, it can feel a bit confusing, but I think it's good to just remember that when you're trying to balance your budget, don't take into account your in-kind. I'll put I've got so Frankie has asked in the chat, what is an example of Vault Festival support, and there are some few examples in a few slides time, so we'll go through it with a bit more detail.
Can I ask a question real quick? Sorry.
Yes, go for it.
Thanks. Just wondering about like balancing. What do you call it? Balancing it. So like when you talk about not having.
Well, you're cutting in and out a bit for me. I'm sorry.
Sorry.
Might be easier if you type it into the chat, and then I'll read it out. But yeah, I will answer your question as soon as it comes through. What's a good thing to talk about here? So We can talk in a little bit more detail about Arts Council and applying for that. But I will kind of be led by you guys in terms of how much you want to talk about that, because that can be a whole session in itself. But I think a good thing to kind of take into consideration when you're budgeting and for your ticket income is, so you should have received your deal memo already that's got details about your ticket costs and the expected income that you can get from that. And then within that, there'll be like a little sort of, oh my God, grid that's got a few different options. So if you sell 10%, this is what you'll make. If you sell 20%, etc. I think when you're budgeting, it can be really don't budget for 100%. It would be great if you could sell all of your tickets, but I think don't budget for it. I would recommend, I have previously often budgeted at 60%, but I know that a lot of people, when they're budgeting for a fringe show, will budget at 40%. So that is basically the 40% capacity of the show. So if you are in a space that has 100 seats, you will budget to sell 60 of those seats or 40 of those seats, and then within that you would then account for the whatever financial split you're on, financial deal you're on, whether you're on the 70-30 or 60-40 if it's the financial relief. But I think as standard, most people are on 70-30. Catherine, I'm going to read your question out. I'm just wondering about balancing accounts and how that happens. It's not expected that Arts Council wants the whole 30k back. Is it more that there's no profit from tickets? I don't think they wouldn't want any of it back. But when you're balancing, so you might budget really conservatively in terms of tickets. So, but what you've expected and what you've budgeted needs to balance. So your incoming needs to equal exactly the same as your planned outgoings. And so you might, at the end of it, end up with a little bit extra if you sell more than 60%. But then you just need to let them know where that money went when you do your activity report at the end. So chances are it went towards something else. Maybe you put a bit more money into your marketing. Maybe you paid someone a little bit more. But yeah, you have a chance at the end to update your budget with the Arts Council in your activity report. So they'll have what you said that you would spend the money on, and then there's a second column next to it that says where you put in exactly how much you actually spent. And then that still needs to balance at the end of it. So you can't leave a chunk of money kind of unqualified for. You have to say, but it's perfectly reasonable to just say that money went into company reserves, or it went into like additional fees. I think a good thing as well to like not forget is the box office charges. So before your split, there's 4% that comes off. So it's split between, so that cost is shared with Vault Festival and you and the artist. But don't forget about that box office charge when you're budgeting, because that can be quite easy to forget, and then it feels like a bit of a surprise. But making sure that you're taking into consideration that. Can also be good as well to make sure that you're budgeting for your venue cost guarantee. as well. So you might want to like really reduce the amount of expected ticket sales to make sure that you can definitely afford that venue cost guarantee, just in case for whatever reason you don't sell the tickets, which I'm sure you all will. But I think it's good to really, really be prepared for that. What else do we have? So yeah, so the Vault Festival support we'll talk about a bit later, mentorship. There might be other in-kind support you get, or there might be other lines of cash income. So you might receive a commission from another venue or a producing company. Let's go. I feel like that's my next slide. Yes, it is. And so yeah, I thought it might just be a little bit helpful to just talk a bit about fundraising. And so there are a few options here. We can look at grants. We can look, feel like I keep talking about it, but we can look at Arts Council. Obviously it's going to be really competitive because it's a huge it is a huge program, and so there's a lot of people, kind of pushes up the amount of people that are applying at the same sort of time. It's very competitive anyway, but I think it's probably worthwhile applying. So if you're going to apply for Arts Council, you're more than likely going to be applying for a project grant. And so with the project grants, you can apply for either below £30,000. And then if you were going to do that, it would take 8 weeks to receive a decision. So I would make sure that you're kind of taking that into consideration in your wider project timeline, and give yourself as much time as you possibly can to do your fundraising. So whether that's applying for money or crowdfunding, just give yourself time to really be able to do yourself justice. If you can, give yourself time to resubmit. So it's going to be really difficult if you're near at the beginning of the festival, but if you're near the end, there may possibly be time still to, if you would submit it now, receive a rejection and then resubmit. Grants that aren't ACE as well. So Eleanor has asked, would love to hear about grants that aren't ACE as well as any insights you have on the new Arts Council form, as it seems a lot harder this time around. Yes, sure. So in terms of other grants, that's a quick one to answer, because it's quite difficult to get funding from other trusts and foundations, mostly just because you often have to be a registered charity to be eligible. And so if you're an independent artist or an independent producer, you're probably unlikely to be a registered charity. Don't want to make any assumptions, but I think off the top of my head, there are places like Unity Theatre, and I feel like I have it written down, Grand Plan, and Victoria Wood Foundation, that you don't have to be a registered charity to apply. There's a page on the Arts Council website that kind of has like other places you could look, and it's got a bit of a list that you could have a look through. But again, like as so many of them, you have to be a registered charity to apply. Oh yeah, I'll type them in so that you can just Victoria. Oops. I'm pretty sure that you don't have to be a registered charity for those ones. But yeah, so I think your best bet as an individual or a small company that's limited by guarantee your best bet is probably going for an Arts Council project grant or a mix of donations, crowdfunding. I think there was a workshop yesterday on crowdfunding, so if you didn't make that one, it would have been recorded. So but yeah, so in terms of, I can do a quick little rundown of the new Arts Council form. You're absolutely right, it is much harder now than it was before. I mean, it was never easy, but it does feel quite difficult now. I think the best piece of advice that I can give is to read their 10-year strategy. It's called Let's Create. It's splashed all over their website. It's really easy to find, but it's not easy to understand. It's quite long, but so previously, when you were applying for Arts Council money, the questions were very much geared towards like, tell us about you, tell us about your project, tell us about the people that you'll engage, and tell us about the money. So it was like quite clear, and you could just answer the questions. And then on their end, they would then judge that and decide whether it met their needs, sort of served their strategy. However, now the questions are geared very specifically towards their current 10-year strategy. So ask you how your project supports these particular aims. And then so rather than clearly just saying we're going to do this and this and this, you have to write it in a way where it responds directly to their strategy. And so the strategy, oh my god, am I going to remember this off the top of my head? Let's find out. So the strategy is broken up into I want to say 4 outcomes and or maybe 3 outcomes and 4 investment principles. So just make sure that you have a look at that. In terms of the outcomes, I think there's a creative, country, cultural, cities maybe, and then another one. But the way that they're sort of broken up is basically about like co-creation, working with communities, it's work in schools, it's work with non-professional artists, and that kind of engagement is one of them, which I think is creative people. And then there's another one which is more about creative placemaking, you know, this thing of trying to get more creative engagement and activity in places where there traditionally hasn't been much. So that one is great if you can get in with a local council and like deliver things as part of their creative placemaking strategy. And then there's the other one, which I can never remember the name of, but that one is more about artists and making new work and collaborating. That one's a good one for if you're collaborating across different sectors as well. But I think if you're applying for money to create a new piece of work to present at Vault Festival, it's that one. And that's why it's annoying that I can't remember what that one's called, but it will make sense. It's the slightly longer sentence. And so you've got the 3 outcomes, and you can choose whether you're answering, you can choose whether to write about your project within that context for 1 or 3 or 2 or 3. So you don't have to answer all 3 of them. You can just say, my project is great for creative people because we're working in schools and we're doing this and that. So you don't have to answer all 3, but I think it's really, really helpful to just read the strategy in detail so that you can like fully understand it and then take it into consideration. And then there are the 4 investment principles, which are just as important. There's only one of those that you have to answer, and that one is the diversity and relevance question. And so that one is a bit like the original sort of communities marketing, like how are you going to reach people, how are you going to make your work accessible, how are you making sure that the people working, the workforce on it is relevant to the work that you're creating and representative. So that there's that one. And then there's there's one on environmental sustainability, there's one on dynamism, which is a slightly funny way of saying that you have a very responsive organizational structure, so you can kind of survive in the modern world. So you might be using digital stuff, or you might be kind of working across lots of different sectors. That one's a good one if you've got like a very varied income generation strategy. But that one again is more for larger organizations. So if you're an independent artist, I wouldn't worry too much about that question, but definitely making sure that you're answering the question on diversity, sustainability, I think, is, if you can answer that, especially with making a piece of work for Vault Festival, creating new work, like reading the Theatre Green book and like taking your advice directly from that and writing it in to your Arts Council application will be good. It's a really good opportunity to kind of there are like clear things that you can do and you can write in there. But yeah, so I think in terms, I feel like there's another one, but I've lost I can't remember it. No, it's gone. Hopefully it'll come back to me. But yeah, I think with Arts Council, make sure that you've given yourself a little bit of time to be able to resubmit if you're able to, and yeah, and just make sure you read that strategy, because the answers aren't in there, but it makes it much easier to understand the questions, because the wording of the question is a lot less clear than it used to be. Did that answer that question? I feel like I rambled a little bit, but let me know if there are any specific bits. Okay, awesome. Yeah, and then obviously ticket sales aren't fundraising. Don't know why I put it in there, but so in terms of income, so taking into consideration your ticket sales, donations is a good one. So you might want to set up a crowdfunding page on a website. Again, I think it's really good to find the recording of yesterday's workshop for that, because I think that would be really helpful if that's something that you feel like you have the networks and the access to. I think as well, like it kind of depends on the show as well. Some are really suited to crowdfunding. Investments, I thought I'd just throw it in here just in case you are thinking about investment, but that's gonna, if you do have an investor for your show, that's gonna kind of make your budgeting process slightly different, because obviously you're not going to be wanting to break even, you're going to be wanting to make a profit. That doesn't mean that you can't apply for grants or apply for Arts Council funding, but it's just you need to sort of level that out and make sure that you're really clearly separating out the any dividends that you might be returning back to your investors. I think it's good to be really careful with investment on a show, on like a smaller fringe show, and have like a really clear agreement with your investor about the sort of risks that are inherently involved with investing in any sort of theatre. Actually, it's like very, very high risk investment, and so most of the time people aren't going to be investing because they're trying to make their money back. But I think it's really, really important to be really, really clear and upfront if you are going to go down that route. And then commissions, I did that in just because it's a nice one, but I think it's always worth keeping an eye out and seeing, I guess, again, sort of thinking about that stuff that I talked about earlier with Arts Council and how they really like cross collaboration, and so whether there is a arts organization, or like if your show has like a particular theme to it, if there's any sort of like donation or commission that you could get from a non-arts organization. I think that can be easy to overlook as an option, but it's definitely a good one to go for if you have the kind of show that has like a really, really strong theme that kind of very directly connects to a specific organization. Like maybe you're doing a show about biodiversity, and so maybe Kew Gardens would be able to donate some money or commission it to do something, who knows. I think also reaching out to universities, so they sometimes have pots of cash for public engagement. And so if your work connects quite nicely with a piece of research that they're like one of their PhD students are doing at the time, that can be a really nice bit of collaboration that can get a little bit of money. So I'd recommend having a think about things like that, not only thinking about the sort of traditional arts funding routes, maybe seeing if you can find it from other places, larger charities as well. Smaller charities, it's quite difficult to get money out of because they are spending the money on their charitable aims. But if you go to a larger organization, they might have a bit of like outreach or engagement money that they would be happy to work with you in exchange for. Oftentimes, if you're going to be working with a researcher or a charity, they might want to be involved from quite early on, as opposed to just coming in and giving you some cash. They might want to like do some development with their researchers and stuff like that. So taking into consideration at what point in your process you are and what is appropriate and what's not. But I think just trying to have those conversations. I think it's good to try and get income from as many different sources, because that will kind of put you in a stronger position if for whatever reason one of them falls over. You've still got bits of money coming from other places. But I know that is obviously really difficult in this current economy. But yeah, does that make sense? Does anyone want me to go into a bit more detail with anything? Any questions? No. So expenditure. What did I want to say here? So I've broken this example, again, totally made up numbers, literally just totally arbitrary, so that the I'm pointing at my screen. You can't see me point at my screen. So the 32,850 total at the bottom, you'll notice that is the same as the income cash 32,850. So just those two numbers need to be the same. So here I've used the same structure as I did for the income. So we've got description, unit cost, multiple, total, actual. With expenditure, you're more likely to use the sort of unit cost multiple collaboration. I haven't here because I've just made up lots of numbers, but you might have something like, it can be really helpful if you have all of your weekly expenses, and then if you suddenly get an extra week of touring time, or you need to knock down a week of rehearsals or not take away a day of rehearsals, you can just sort of change the multiple and it goes tap, 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 tap. And then it can be really helpful rather than having to rework it out every single time. Here I have split this up into what I think are the sort of more high level budget categories that are good to think about. So you've got your creative team fees. That might be your writer, your director. We all know what a creative team is. And then having that in a section. Oh, one thing that I often find quite helpful when I'm budgeting is thinking about the like key activities and then using those as categories. So you might have like a section for a section for rehearsals, and then you have all your rehearsal costs, and then you've got a section for engagement, and then you've got all your workshop costs, and then you've got a section running costs, and then you'll have that in there. Because sometimes it can be tempting to split it up by people, and then rehearsal space, and then this, and then that. And then if you have it chunked into actual activity, kind of, it can make it easier to edit as you're going along. Oops. And so here, yeah, I've got creative team fees, thinking about all of the different, I think when you're doing your budget, similar to doing a timeline, to like in your brain go through all of the individual steps of everything that you're going to need to do, and then try and think, is any of that going to cost me any money? So like an easy thing to forget about is like the money for van hire or taxis from this place to this place. So if you're rehearsing in North London, and then you need to like get down to Waterloo, like just considering all of those little expenses, and the best and the easiest way to do that is to just kind of in your mind's eye go along the whole process. I feel like that seems like stating the obvious, but it can be really easy to kind of overlook details, and then and that's just not the budgets, they're not the place you want to be overlooking those sorts of details.
So
and then
I just have a question, if that's okay.
yeah, absolutely.
How do you, could be a tangent, so I don't mind if we like circle back to it later, but how do you evidence costs to, for example, to Arts Council? Would they, like, do they continue to go off the budget, or do we provide invoices, or will they look at bank statements? Just, yeah, how do we like justify, or what extent do we need to justify the expenditure?
It's a good question. They won't look at bank statements, they won't look at anything. If you have a look at the bottom, so it's just, I think it's helpful to break your budget down into as much detail as possible. So you wouldn't just put creative team fees 15 grand, you'd put writer to 2 days at £200 equals 400, and then that would go into your budget. So making sure that I've put here, show you're working out, but if you're breaking that out into the details so they can see the logic of how you reach that number, because they're reading budgets all the time, they have like a really good idea of how much things cost, and so they'll know whether you've done your research and whether that's a reasonable amount of money, or whether you've just made it up. And so I think just showing that you've researched it. They'll also there's a section in the application form where they ask you to give a bit more detail about where you got your like the numbers from your artistic costs or your overheads and stuff like that. So there's an opportunity there to put in a bit more detail, but they're not gonna check for bank statements, they're not going to check for invoices. They do, I believe they do spot checks, so do tell the truth on your activity plan or activity report when you're saying how much you've spent, because who knows, they might ask for those invoices, but as part of the sort of standard process they don't. But yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, so physical production costs, again, oh, look at my totals, like way out, what a mess. Anyway, I'm not going to change it, I've already told you they're made up numbers, so it doesn't really matter. So thinking about your creative team, thinking about the physical production costs, thinking about the company fees, so your actors, your stage manager, you might have an ops person, you might have your own technician, you might be using Vault Festival's technician, so thinking about what your who you need as part of your team. If you have like a big set, which is really unlikely, but thinking about if you need additional crew to help you with your get in and your get out and stuff like that. But I think that's probably less relevant for a Vault Festival show. I don't know why I've separated out rehearsal space hire from everything else, but I guess that maybe from that you could talk about creative process. So any costs within that are allocated to the creative process. So that might be workshopping, it might be rehearsal space, it might be like drinks for the invitees when they come and watch the scratch version of it before it makes it to Vault Festival. Marketing and PR, I think this is an easy place to knock money off a budget, and to think that you can knock money off a budget and be like, don't worry, I'll just do it myself. I think it's a good one to try and keep in if you can, and really it's really worth it. There are some obviously you do receive some marketing support from Vault Festival, as in being just part of the festival program, but do remember that there are over 500 productions as part of over the 8 weeks, so it's good to supplement that with additional marketing and PR work. You can also buy kind of additional marketing and PR support from Vault Festival, which you don't have to pay for upfront. It comes out of the split at the end, so that can be really helpful for cash flow as well. But I think that is a really important section. Administration costs, so your general manager, your producer, your maybe you've got some office overheads, who knows. And then the very important one is the contingency. So making sure that you are putting a line in there for somewhere around 5% of your total budget. Some people put your contingency slightly lower, some people put it slightly higher, but I think I'd say standard is about 5%. And so your contingency is basically just like a ring-fenced chunk of money that you haven't budgeted for so you haven't allocated it to anything in your budget, but it's there in case there is an unexpected cost somewhere. And there normally is. There's normally something. There's that someone needed taxis instead of getting the bus, and that's gotten more expensive, or there will be something. So making sure that you budget with a contingency in mind, and also don't get tempted to be like, oh, we forgot about this thing that we don't really need, let's just take it from the contingency. A contingency is a really helpful tool to kind of save you when you're in the project itself. And so any questions on any of that?
Hello. I hope you don't. Can I ask a question about ACE? But it's actually for a previous project, but might be helpful for this one.
Oh yeah, go for it.
Okay. Sorry, I'm just in the middle of doing that activity report, and I thought, while you're here, in terms of audience reach, I basically had a producer who had to leave halfway through, and she did some very big numbers because she was counting sort of social media reach of followers for our company, but also the actors who were in it and stuff. So I've included those at the end. Is that normal?
Yeah, so it kind of have it as two columns next to each other's, isn't it? So it's like, this is what you said, this is who you said you would reach.
Yes.
And then you say the number that you actually did. But yeah, I think it's kind of split between streaming, digital, and then the sort of more live engagement. So I'm assuming that she's put in the big numbers under the sort of digital section.
Yes, yeah, in terms of, because obviously you can't guarantee who's seen your post, but we did quite a lot of outreach in terms of like raising awareness of the topic on posts and things.
Yeah.
I just wanted to double check that. I was
Yeah.
like 300,000. There's only 200 people came to the show. Like,
Yeah, I think that's normal. I think if you can do that, or you could, if you wanted to be really good, you could have a look at the sort of like your data on the social media channels that kind of show the activity and engagement that you've had when you posted something, but that's going to really lower your number. So you might want to just say that you did post on that Twitter page, and that is the amount of followers they've got, so chances are they reach that many people.
I've written like a breakdown of everything in case they ever ask to explain what I've done. But no, thank you for that. But I think that could be helpful for this, because you get to the end and you think, oh my goodness. But yes, thank you.
No, you're very welcome. That's all good. Oh, we've got something in the chat. Cool. Thanks, Frankie. Bye. Oh, where are we? So but yeah, unless there's any more questions, I'll move on. So I just wanted to mention the venue cost guarantee. This is literally just copied and pasted from the artist agreement, so this hopefully isn't any new information. I'm sure you all read your agreement thoroughly, word for word, right? Yeah, good. But I think I mentioned it kind of briefly at the top, just to make sure that you're budgeting for like very worst case scenario, and making sure that you've got it in your budget. But basically, the way that the venue cost guarantee works is that there are lots of overheads to run the festival, obviously, and so that is then all of those costs are broken down into thirds. Vault Festival commits to paying 2 of those thirds, and then the 1/3 is shared out across all of the artists. And so you'll see in your deal memo, I always forget that word. You'll see in your deal memo, there's a lot of detail in there around exactly what the venue cost guarantee is, but basically there is there'll be like a minimum amount. Basically, if you think of it as like venue hire, but it's not really, but if you think of it as venue hire, and then your whatever your ticket sales are, once they've gone above that, once they've gone above the venue cost guarantee, then it just goes back to your normal 70-30, 60-40 split. But one thing to be very, very, very aware of is that if your ticket sales don't go over the venue cost guarantee, then there is a chance that you could end up owing Vault Festival money at the end of that. So just be really aware of that, and make sure that you're budgeting for it. So maybe you want to make sure that when you're fundraising, you can afford to sell no tickets. So maybe that's where your contingency comes in. But again, I'm sure that won't happen. I'm sure you're all going to sell very, very well and be flush. But I think it's good to take that into consideration. I also think it's helpful when you're budgeting to maybe have 2 versions of your budget. So have like your best case scenario and your worst case scenario. So you might have your like, this is what the project looks like if we do get Arts Council funding, or if we do hit our donations target. This is how much everyone costs. This is the team. This is how many weeks we're rehearsing. This is how much money we're spending on the set and the costume. And then you might have a second version of that budget, which is, we didn't get the Arts Council grant, but we're still going to go ahead, but there's now less people, or there's less rehearsal days, or that beautiful like the big star that was gonna like be made out of something gorgeous isn't it. We're just going to pretend that that's there now. It's not going to be there. And so just making sure that you've got those two that backup plan. I think I've just turned this into such a negative call. I'm like, be prepared for the worst, but I do think you should be. But yeah, so I think so that's that. What else did I put? I feel like I put other helpful things. Oh yeah, just that reminder. So we've spoken about the fact that sort of for parity, everyone's offered a 70-30 split, which I will say at the moment is actually quite good, because there are a lot of venues that aren't able to offer anything higher than a 65-35. Is that right? Yeah, 65-35 split, or even some places doing oh no, I don't. So there's a lot of places that aren't really able to offer anything this good. So obviously it's difficult time. But if you went for the financial relief, then you might be on a 60-40 as well. I think. Oh goodness, no, I've confused myself. But and then we mentioned this at the top. We've got the box office commission, so don't forget about that when you're budgeting and you're thinking about your ticket income, making sure that you're taking into consideration that 4% that comes off before the split. So don't work out your split and then take 4% off, because then you'll be taking off too much. And then in terms of, I thought I'd just mention settlements. So this again is just basically copied out of your agreement, but you'll get sent a summary of your final sales 21 days after your final performance. It's a self-billing invoice, which basically means that you don't have to invoice. You would have by then, or probably should have already, given us your bank details through Eventatron. So basically we already have that information. You'll receive your self-billing invoice. You just double check that all of that information is still correct, and then you'll receive your funds 7 days after that. So I think this is probably one of the fastest turnaround times, but just making sure that you're banking that so that when you're working out your cash flow, so that you know when that final bit of money is going to come in, so that you haven't promised anyone a fee before your settlement comes through, basically. So making sure that you're thinking of that. And so here are some sort of examples of some in-kind support. Like I said, that you're gonna as being part of the festival, you'll be part of the you'll be on the box office system, and there'll be like all of the front of house services that you kind of receive as being part of the festival. I've estimated somewhere around £200 for that. And then you've got the arts industry services and networking events. So workshops like this one. There's a run of maybe about 6 online workshops up until the beginning of the festival. And then during the festival, there'll be a bunch that are happening in person at the festival. Those ones are mostly sort of future facing ones, so they might have one on touring or one on networking and stuff like that. So like thinking about what you're going to do with your show after. Again, as being part of the festival, you sort of automatically get there's lots of people, or a few people joining now. I hope you guys weren't expecting it to start at 7. Or are we just late? And that's fine. Nothing wrong with being late. And then so for the 1 or 2 people that just joined, we're just going through some examples of what you could include as in-kind support from Vault Festival if you're applying for Arts Council money. And so, yeah, so you'll be part of the festival sort of marketing and PR campaign anyway. Like I said before, don't rely on that. Make sure that you have your own marketing campaign. Oh, you're all good, Rebecca. Make sure that you've got your own marketing campaign and you're budgeting money towards it because it will help. But there's a bit of additional support that comes from being part of the program. And then what do we have? So we've got some technical staff to facilitate the turnarounds between the shows. So things like small things like that can be quite easy to overlook, but are very helpful to bump up your in-kind support. So if you were applying for Arts Council money, you would need at least 10% in match funding. And that match funding can be a combination of cash or in-kind. It can be mostly in-kind, but it can't be all in-kind. So you'll have to find some cash, but you've already got expected ticket income to sort of play that part. So yeah, so you can take that sort of 22.50 plus VAT and then times it by the number of shows you've got, and you can add that in. And then you each get a bit of time in the space for technical rehearsals. And so that kind of depends on the space you're in. It depends on the show. So, but there's a link here which you'll get, because I'll share this with you guys, or we'll pop it up online. But you can also find that on the resources page. You can find most things on the resources page on vaultfestival.com. But there'll be a section on production and technical, I think, which has a bit more detail around your technical rehearsals. But you can include that time in as well as part of your in-kind support. And then yeah, and so if you're doing a longer show, you might be able to increase that a bit, but I think every little helps when it comes to that. But hopefully that's helpful.